A few years ago, not long after Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generations, a discussion started in this country about recognising Indigenous Australians in the Constitution in some way. And in some way is an important phrase. Some, such as the then opposition leader Tony Abbott, who had a very long and authentic commitment to Indigenous policy, supported a new line in the Constitution's preamble, something like this: we acknowledge the fact modern Australia has an Indigenous heritage and a British foundation and an immigrant character. Well, others wanted more, much more. They wanted clauses in and clauses out, and the debate then became about substantial constitutional change rather than fixing a historic anomaly, a symbolic gesture, if I can call it that. Then it all just fell away because Abbott was deposed and Malcolm Turnbull later rejected the report from the specially convened Indigenous body that was set up to consult on constitutional change. My view then, and still my view today, is that any attempt to change our nation's constitution to do more than provide a symbolic statement in the opening preamble would fail. Indeed, even getting a majority of people in a majority of states to support a new line in the preamble would take a lot of political capital. But lo and behold, as time passed, it became clear that this wasn't an issue about recognition in the Constitution, but a stalking horse for so much more. Some Aboriginal leaders, like Senator Pat Dodson, Labor's Senator Pat Dodson, wanted a constitutionally entrenched anti-discrimination clause. That would have meant potential judicial review of just about every act of Parliament to see whether or not it passed the test. The courts would have been second-guessing the people's elected representatives, a bit like they do in the United States. And of course, that's not what we want here. Others, like the new Indigenous Affairs Minister sworn in yesterday, Ken Wyatt, wanted a constitutionally entrenched Indigenous voice in our nation's affairs, over and above the voice that Aboriginal people have, like everyone else, indeed through the seat that Ken Wyatt has in his parliament, through our parliament, where there are now at least 5 members and senators as our representatives in Canberra who identify as Aboriginal. In the recent election campaign, Labor, as we know, was pushing this new Indigenous body idea, a virtual third chamber of the Parliament. The Liberals, well, they certainly weren't in favour of Labor's idea, but they didn't have much else to say in this area, other than supporting good policy that actually changes the lives of Indigenous people, like kids going to school, parents in work, and the law of the land equally applying to us all. Or that's what we thought until today. In Queensland's Courier Mail this morning, courtesy of my regular guest, Renee Valaris, we've found out precisely what sort of a voice new Minister Ken Wyatt wants Aboriginal people to have. And it's a mini parliament of a kind, so that Indigenous people can sit in judgment, potentially, on everything that the real Parliament does. Wyatt's Makarrata Commission would have a chairman and 64 elected elders, 8 from each state and territory, plus 10 full-time associate commissioners. This would obviously be very expensive, as well as a very large and very busy body. And don't think that this is just a wild idea from Ken Wyatt. As you can see on the screen, he's gone so far as to get pages and pages of legislation drafted to make it all a reality. Now, if it was established, this body could conduct public inquiries, undertake research, analyse government policy and monitor the performance of government bodies that affect Indigenous Australians. In other words, it would monitor the performance of the entire federal government from an Aboriginal perspective. It would also investigate complaints from Indigenous groups against anyone, federal government, agencies and indeed the public. It could inform itself, in the words of the draft legislation, in any way it thinks fit. Very much, in my mind, the same way that you have a standing Royal Commission. Now, only a naturally born bureaucrat could come up with this sort of useless, self-important and completely counterproductive body. I mean, this is the old and discredited ATSIC 2.0. And it's a real worry that all of this was drafted back in February when Ken Wyatt, who was then the aged care minister, not the Indigenous minister, drafted it all and passed it on to Scott Morrison. It wasn't released as policy in the election campaign, and I know many Liberal supporters would find it a backwards step and argue that it does nothing to practically change the lives of Indigenous people if it was established. I mean, it will not get one extra Aboriginal kid to school. It will not get one extra Aboriginal adult into a real job. And it would not get an extra policeman into remote Australia or protect a single Indigenous woman from bashings or an Indigenous child from sexual abuse. But of course, it would make every teacher, every nurse and every cop's job so much harder and tied up in rules. It would turbocharge the grievance industry. And if it didn't lead to similar bodies for women, migrants, people with a disability, etc., it would make every other group that feels disadvantaged resentful against a so-called special deal for Aboriginal people. And you know what's the worst aspect of this terrible proposal? It's exactly the kind of dingbat idea that a Labor government would come up with. And Scott Morrison's just been re-elected precisely because he was not going to run his government like a Labor-light government. I've seen a lot of really silly ideas in my 16 years in government, but I can't recall one as bad and as divisive, and I think as secret as this one. Well, not secret after Renee Valaris' story today. The Prime Minister won't like overruling his new minister on just his second day in the job, but the sooner this is dead, buried and cremated, the better for the Liberal Party and the better for everyone else.